a little bit to us about himself, what he does, and why he is here visiting us today. We already have some students and teachers here to say hi. Book Lover, how are you doing? Colin's here joining us, Ms. Torres, and we have Caitlin. So we're really excited. If you have questions or comments, please use that side tool. Just remember, this is a professional setting. We ask you just to use your first name and any comments or questions you might have. So I'm going to hop off, give you the floor, and I'll be back on when it's about time to end today. Sound good?
Yeah.
All right.
All right. So thank you all so much for joining in. My name is Colin Seale, and I'm actually here in Phoenix, Arizona. I'm outside doing this because I have a 4-year-old and a 7-year-old, and they are committing some random acts of terror in my home right now. So I figured the best way to do this and make sure I was able to be fully available would be to take this one outside. So I'm really excited to connect. I had a chance to meet your teacher and your principal out in New Mexico back in November at the National Association for Gifted Children conference, and been really having a great time staying in touch. And just to tell you a little bit about myself, I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, where at a really young age, I was identified for a gifted and talented program. And what's interesting is I got identified for this gifted program at 7 years old. And at the tender age of 37, I was diagnosed with having ADHD. So what's interesting is I know that a lot of kids that are gifted, your brains kind of work in a lot of unique ways. What I want to really step back and kind of spend some time talking about today is all the ways that those unique aspects of the way you think, the way you approach the world can actually end up being a very incredible benefit for you. So I want to start with really introducing you to an aspect of my work in a way that might be really engaging to you all. So please feel free to drop in any comments, ideas as we start to talk about this discussion. So part of why I started an organization called Think Law, where we teach critical thinking using real life legal cases, is because when I was a math teacher, I actually went to law school at night. And I want to share with you an example of a problem that we had in law school, okay? So I don't know how many people here have interest in being a lawyer or anything like that, but whether you do or you don't, you should find the scenario very interesting because it's a real life case. So there was a 5-year-old boy named Brian. And this kid, Brian, saw his aunt about to sit down in a chair. Just before she sat, he pulled out the chair. She fell, broke her hip, had $11,000 in medical injuries, and she turned around and sued her own 5-year-old nephew for battery. Let me tell you this one more time. Brian is 5 years old. He saw his aunt about to sit down in the chair. Just before she sat, he pulled out the chair. She fell, broke her hip, had $11,000 in medical injuries. She turned around and sued her own 5-year-old nephew for battery. Now, a battery happens when you make intentional contact that's harmful and causes damages. So just by chatting in a chat box, like a quick yes or no, how many of you would think that this 5-year-old boy should be responsible for this battery, for this lawsuit, for these injuries? Just throw in a yes, throw in a no. And as we start thinking through this, a lot of you are probably thinking, well, that's ridiculous. He's only 5. 5-year-olds can't be responsible for something like that. He's only 5. But now I want to push you on something. I want you to imagine that you were the aunt's attorney. Here you are. This woman is coming to you because her hip is broken and she's all messed up and she needs your help. To help her, you need to come up with all the creative things that she might use to prove that he is responsible, that he is liable. So maybe a lot of you in your gut feeling say, well, I don't know, he's only 5. And your gut feeling is important. Your gut feeling comes from your knowledge, from your values, from your experiences. But like acknowledging your gut feeling is even more important because it helps us understand our initial bias. Let's step outside of our initial bias and let's start thinking to ourselves, well, if you were the aunt, and I told you these facts one more time, like he saw her about to sit, and right before she sat, he pulled out the chair, she fell and broke her hip. I start to realize, wait a minute. This 5-year-old might be only 5, but he did see her about to sit. He did physically remove the chair, but he didn't just remove it. He removed it at the exact moment she was about to sit. So maybe I can't look in his head and prove for a fact that he did it, but it seems like that timing makes it very suspicious. So now we're starting to think about different sides. We're starting to flex our thinking a little bit. We can even start to predict, well, why is this woman even suing her own 5-year-old nephew? Like, who does that kind of stuff? Well, maybe there's some family drama. Maybe Brian is just that kid who does this stuff all the time and somebody has to hold him responsible at some point. It doesn't really matter. But what matters is we're starting to get to a mindset. We're starting to get into this level of creativity where we're thinking beyond the obvious. We're starting to stretch our imagination. We're even starting to think about, like, what are the big picture consequences? What would the world look like if you could just go around pulling out chairs on people? They get seriously hurt, but they couldn't recover because of the age of the person that did it to them. At the same time, and I don't know how many of y'all have like 5-year-olds in your households or in your homes, or if you had 5-year-olds being sued for practical jokes that go wrong, I mean, the courts would be overflowing with cases. 5-year-olds do random, ridiculous stuff all day, every day. So how do we find that balance? And this right here, this right here, this is the kind of critical thinking that we need you all to have as young people. Listen to me. If you look around what's happening in this country with this global pandemic, it's very tricky. We have a lot of complicated things happening. We've got doctors that are trying to treat something where there's no cure. There's no treatment plan. There's no step-by-step manual on how to address this. So what are they doing? They're looking at what's happening. They're tracking trends. They're experimenting with new procedures. They're trying to see what kind of old procedures might apply to this new one. There's no rule book. So in a world where so often we're glued to this idea of success as like getting good grades and achieving at high levels and going to a really good college and getting a really good job, we've got to make sure we don't forget about why critical thinking matters. Why critical thinking, this idea of not just having these skills, but also these mindsets where you start looking beyond the obvious. You start questioning beyond what's right in front of you. So let me step back for a second. Okay. You think we understand battery? We think we kind of went through this case with this boy in a chair and all this stuff. And if I told you that the outcome of this case was that Brian actually lost, the judge found and that Brian was responsible, even though he probably didn't mean to put her in a hospital, even though he probably, didn't like purposely want to injure her, he did purposely pull out the chair. So he should be responsible. Let me switch it up for you real quick, all right? Now, there's another case about two boys. And two boys are in one man's backyard and they're sitting on top of his sheds. And he's like, hey, get off my shed. This is the universal old man thing, right? Like just kind of wave your fist, get off my shed. And one boy gets off right away. The other boy is taking his sweet time and not listening, not responding. So as we start looking at this, as we start seeing this scenario, the old man gets frustrated. He takes a stick and he throws it at the boy that's still on top of his shed. But the man has bad aim. Instead of throwing it at the boy on top of his shed, which he intended to do to scare the boy to get off, the stick ended up hitting the boy that already got off of his shed. And it didn't just hit him, it hit him in the eye. And it didn't just hit him in the eye, it blinded him for life in that one eye. So this is interesting. If a battery is intentional contact that causes damages, what might this old man try to say in court to get out of this? If you're putting two and two together, he's going to say, well, I didn't mean to hit this kid in the eye. What I meant to do was just throw this stick at this other kid and scare him. And you start thinking about that and you're like, well, I guess there's no intent there. But then wait a minute. What would the world look like? What would the world look like if you can get away with that kind of defense? Could you say throw a brick at somebody, but you threw it at the wrong person and say, oops, I actually meant to hit the other person? That really wouldn't make any sense. that really wouldn't work. Like we'd have to find a way to broaden the rule, to look at it a little bit differently. So maybe it's not about like what you meant to do in terms of that person, but the act. If the act you meant to do was a bad act, then you should be held responsible no matter who gets hurt by that bad act. So we start to stretch our imagination. We start to realize that like rules are rules, but they don't necessarily apply identically in each situation. For those of you that are old enough to like, you're changing class schedules all the time and you're going to different classrooms, you know that not every teacher has the same set of rules. Some of you might even see that in your own households where not every parent has the same set of rules. So you've got to be able to adapt and flex your understanding to that. And right now, there's no better time to think about what that looks like than this space where schools are closed and here we are at home. So let's think about this. Let's kind of step back and think about like, what does any of this mean in terms of where we are at in this distance learning space? I don't know about you all, but like when I was in middle school, I was still in a self-contained gifted program in Brooklyn, and like I had my crew. I had my set of people that we took all our classes together, and I never really looked outside of that. On top of that, outside of my school settings, I never really made an effort to connect with people because I was in school all the time connecting with people. So it never really would occur to me that that would actually be a priority. So let's step back for a second and ask ourselves, in an era of like social distancing and everybody working from home and schooling from home, how do you stay connected with peers? And not just any kind of connection, but like an actual healthy connection. Because, I played a lot of video games as a kid, but like, are video games necessarily the healthiest form of connection? And if we talk about connecting, like, is connecting with any old random person online going to be the appropriate thing? Like, what does it look like? How should we think about what real connection ought to look like during these times? So for me, I go all the way back to critical thinking. I think about what are the problems that our communities need to solve, and maybe my peers and my classmates can be the ones to help solve that problem. So I know that a lot of communities are struggling with this idea of social distancing, this idea of how do you make it so that people feel okay being 6 to 10 feet apart from one another when they're walking. It just seems like a weird thing to do. You got a space where kids are being discouraged from playing at parks. And even if you're taking a walk or going on a jog, like you want to stay distant from one another. And it's weird. A lot of us like to give handshakes and hugs. So, like, how do we get through this? And what I say is, I don't think adults have all the answers. In fact, if history has shown us anything, it's that young people are the innovators. Young people have no barriers in their thoughts. Like, we need you to think about this. So, I want to give you a quick sort of activity and an idea around how you might be able to work through these problems as a team, as something that you can figure out informally with peers of your classmates through your Google Classrooms or whatever setups you have so that you can start to really build more healthy connections. What if you started by thinking about like, what's the real problem? Like, why is social distancing so tough? And just keep on asking why from one another, right? So, for instance, if I were to tell you that in 1971, 93% of high school athletes were men or boys, and only 7% were girls. Why would you think that that's the case? That back in 1971, there would be such a big difference between the percentage of girls playing sports and the percentage of boys playing sports? You might see that and say, well, maybe boys like sports more than girls. But if you say that, I want you to ask yourself, why? Why is that? Why might boys like sports more than girls, particularly in 1971? Well, maybe boys get a lot more opportunity to play sports than girls. Well, why? Well, maybe because boys are pushed into sports more often, while girls back then might have been pushed into doing other things that were supposedly more ladylike or whatever have you. And as we start asking why and digging down, coming up with that root cause, you could end up with very compelling solutions. I once saw a group of young people, these are middle school kids, and you know who they blamed for that gender gap in sports? They blamed Target, Walmart, any place where you go to buy toys. And they blamed them because they said, you know what? They separate the boys and girls toys in these aisles. If instead they basically kind of mixed it all up, then kids wouldn't feel this pressure to act one certain way, to like one certain thing. And kids will be more free to do what they want. So that's a mini version of the kind of root cause analysis, the kind of critical thinking that you could work together in a group on and come up with very intriguing ideas around something as important as social distancing. We've got a lot of high school graduates, a lot of even eighth grade promotion ceremonies where adults are trying to figure out how do we safely get our kids to experience something that moves them to the next step, this promotion, this sort of graduation, something to celebrate, to scream about, to wear signs and put on your caps and gowns in an era where we're told not to congregate in groups of more than 10. Do you really want the adults to be the only one with those solutions? Or do you want to bring your solutions to the table? Think about ways that you might be able to connect and collaborate with your peers to start answering these questions and start asking these questions and proposing ideas and getting feedback on those ideas, using that feedback to improve those ideas. I can tell you that personally, 5 years ago, I was practicing law and I realized that my heart was still in education. But I knew that I didn't want to get into education the same way I did before. Because the reality is, in my Brooklyn, New York neighborhood, I was one of very few kids that ended up having access to a gifted and talented program. And since I had such limited access to this sort of a program, I felt like my story was an exception to the rule. Coming up, like I came up as a kid that was on free and reduced lunch, as a kid which family struggled with poverty, like it shouldn't be so rare to get the kind of success that I had academically and professionally coming from my neighborhood, but it was rare. So how do I design a world where it's not rare anymore? And for me, my solution was to obsess over critical thinking. And this is why I started this organization, Think Law, because I wanted to spark this critical thinking revolution. I wanted to make sure that you as young people understood your power. You are the change that you've been waiting for. So when you see your educators reaching out for your opinions or for your ideas, like they're not just asking for the sake of asking. They're asking because it actually matters. They're asking because you actually matter. Like you deserve to be seen. And one of the things I want you to understand is that we live in a world where if all you do in your life is work hard, put your head down and work hard. I'm just going to try my best. I'm going to work hard. There's a lot of good things that come out of that because you know that you're working hard. But here's the cold reality. It can't just be about working hard. That's not the way the world actually works. It's kind of a myth that all you do is work hard to get ahead. You've got to work hard and connect with people. You've got to work hard and be nice to people. You got to work hard and be a really good connector and collaborator and creator. Like it can't be just enough to be right. You got to also understand how to do right. Okay, quick example of that. My daughter, um, she's an advanced learner herself. She skipped over the first grade. And one day I'm doing dishes, and I'll take questions in a second right after this part. But one day I'm doing dishes. I'm like, hey, Rose, pass me a cup. And she's like, Dad, there's no cup. And she's sitting at the table, and I'm seeing this cup. And I'm like, yo, Rose, like, seriously, I need that cup to do the dishes. Can you please pass me the cup? And she's like, Dad, there's no cup. I see a glass, though. And I'm like, oh, my goodness. Don't even think about becoming that kid who knows exactly what I'm saying, but finds some minor technicality just to make me feel stupid because I didn't use the exact right word. I said cup instead of glass, because that is the kind of stuff that you do if you don't want to have friends. That's the kind of stuff that you do if you don't want people to really respect you and to be someone that has the power of persuasion and influence. So be less concerned with being right than the very important task of doing right. So I'd love to take any questions you all might have about like my work, about my approach, um, about how I'm surviving quarantine with the family. Any questions? And I'll kind of take the jump on one question that I think comes up a lot, which is, how did you figure out what you wanted to do when you grew up? And I'll say honestly, I didn't. I didn't. I prescribed a lot to something that a guy named Jamie Cassip, who works for Google, He says it's all the time. He says we need to stop asking what you want to do when you grow up. Instead, we got to start asking, what problem do you want to solve? And if you think about what problem you want to solve and spend your life developing the skills to solve that problem, now you're in a whole nother plateau. Now you're on a whole nother platform because your drive, your passion, your freedom, like you don't need to be in a specific role to be fighting for that change. So I was a computer science graduate who became a math teacher, who worked in child welfare, who went back into teaching, who went to law school at night, who practiced law. And now I have my own organization. I write for Forbes. My Thinking Like a Lawyer book just is getting released tomorrow. Like, I work with schools in 30 states based off of this problem that I've been trying to solve at least for the last 15 years, which is, how do I create a world where stories like mine are no longer exceptions to the rule, but instead all kids have a real shot at being exceptional? So that's how you think about how you grow up. How do you survive self isolation? So I'm going to tell you, this has been a challenge for me as someone who travels a lot and is used to working with large crowds and meeting new people every few weeks. It's been a little hard. I realize that you actually have to make an effort to connect with people. You actually have to find a way to, like, not just sit at home by yourself staring at a screen or binge watching shows on Netflix. You have to make human connections with people. And I can tell you something, like, I had a really sad death in my family due to COVID-19. And I couldn't go to the funeral because it was in New York City. But I connected with my family members from all around the world via Zoom. And then later that afternoon, a good friend of ours in Las Vegas got married via Zoom. And it was amazing. And I realized, like, wow, like, there's all this power to connect with people, to call relatives, to call friends that I haven't caught up for a long time. And in many ways, as isolated as we are, I feel more connected with my friends and my family than I have for years. And I don't want to take those moments for granted. And I want to make sure I keep that going after this period is all done. Somebody asked about food. Not quite sure exactly what the question is about food, but let me tell you something. I really love eating junk food. I loved getting takeout all the time and doing a whole bunch of, like, food that's probably not that healthy for you, especially when you're traveling. It's been really nice to be at home, to be eating more healthy, to get into a more steady routine, to not be grabbing like a burger and fries at 11 o'clock at night. And what's interesting about that is, like a lot of other things in this world, what you put in is what you get out. What you put into your body, if it's healthy, if it's good energy, if it's high quality, then what comes out is energy and healthy and high quality. I feel like I'm more vivacious during the day. I feel like I'm just going at a much more, like, focused rate. I'm much less distracted. So that's the kind of thing I appreciate about the quarantine diet. And how to get a book published. So here's another thing that's very interesting. Anybody could publish a book about anything at any time, right? Because we live in a kind of era where you can self-publish and you could look up a million resources on the internet to figure this out. But to get a book published through a publisher, you've got to have a story to tell. And I'm going to save you the mystery. Every single one of you have a story to tell. The way to get a book published is by telling the story before you have the book. So being able to tell the story before you have the book and get a story that captivates people, that motivates people, doesn't have to be perfect. When I started Think Law, I didn't have some fancy curriculum. I didn't have some fancy website. I had one lesson written down in Microsoft Word about a boy that pulled out a chair and his aunt. And I decided to just roll with that. So roll with whatever you've got. We got another great question about how education might change and how we might capitalize this for our gifted kids. So here's the thing. A lot of times when we talk about transformation and reimagination in education, it's really hard. Education is a very hard system to change because things have been the way that they have been for a very long time. The one thing that I think might be very different going forward is this idea that students have a lot more agency than we think. They have a lot more of their ability to kind of handle the way in which they approach tasks than we typically would give them credit for. So right now, when teachers have realized they've got to let go of a whole lot of control because you don't have as much control over what's happening in people's homes and when they're able to access a device, whatever have you. That is my one hope, that we recognize, like, we were never supposed to be controlling kids. It was always supposed to be managing the kids that we have to set the stage for them to be excellent. So I hope that if nothing else, we're able to step back a little bit from this idea that we've got to be in control of, like, every kid must be sitting like this and track the speaker like this and, like, make sure you're all sitting in very neat rows and raise your hand. Like, there's got to be a little bit more flexibility and adaptability, especially if it's going to be true that we might be starting and stopping school at different points throughout these next couple of years as this virus ebbs and flows before we end up with a vaccination or treatment for it. People that just moved to a new school, making new friends in a new system. Here's where, again, leveraging powers of networks is going to be really important. I know that connecting online can feel sort of awkward, but in many ways, it might be one of the only things we have to do. And as someone who lives in Phoenix that has had at least 2 to 3 year long meaningful back and forth with people that I've never met in person because of Twitter or because of Facebook or other social media stuff, like, I've never even stepped foot in the state of Missouri, for instance. I've never stepped foot, but I'm going to be the keynote speaker for the Gifted Association Conference in Missouri this fall. I'm here meeting with you all right now. And, like, by the end of this, I'm going to feel like I understand things through your questions and answers. So, like, that's kind of what we need to do. We need to kind of give our kids a little bit more of a bandwidth and opportunity to understand, how can you make meaningful connections in this distance learning contact? Because let's be real, your kids, when they grow up, they are going to have interviews that look like this. They are going to have classes that look like this, because it's almost impossible today to graduate college without taking at least one online class. Even most high schools have you taking at least one online class, particularly if you're doing dual enrollment at a college at that time. So let's get them ready for a world where making meaningful connections this way is actually going to be a real thing. Do we have any other questions? Any other questions? How do you keep track of all the different things that are going on? All right, here's a tip. Give yourself a news diet. Seriously, I limit my news intake to 15 minutes a day. You've got to think about your own mental health. I mean, there are a lot of people dying. We just reached 1 million coronavirus cases across the country. And I just was reading a report this morning that talked about most states, when you look at their death rates compared to death rates from last year, it seems like more people are dying than ever before. So it appears that we're not even really sure of what the extent is of the deadliness of this disease. So this is where I've got to stop myself and say, you know what, Colin, chill out. You got to find a way to be productive. Like, for everything that I look at that makes me feel doom and gloom, I've got to build something into the world that sparks joy, that sparks happiness. I got to figure out something powerful or exciting to do with my kids. And maybe I want to play some music. Maybe I want to have a dance party in my house with my 4-year-old and 7-year-old, because you know what? Sometimes you just got to let out some energy. So I urge you all to find that balance between being informed, being knowledgeable, but also being mentally healthy, calling a friend, putting together like a virtual chat, doing something that actually makes you feel good, makes you laugh, makes you enjoy something. Do it as someone together, like bake a cake. If you don't know how to bake, then bake a terrible cake. They're actually kind of hilarious. Have fun. Live, experience. Everyone is in similar boats right now where nobody is in their ideal routine. Roll with that.
Colin, you are amazing. Everyone, thank you so much for your amazing questions and comments. Thank you so much. Congratulations on your book. I am so excited. I've already purchased mine on Amazon. I'm a big supporter, and I appreciate your support and everything that you do for the gifted community. So have a great day. Enjoy the weather. And I hope that we see you really soon. Any last thoughts or anything else you want to say?
Just thank you all so much. Stay safe out there. And if you are interested in kind of learning more about our work, always feel free to check us out at Think Law US on Twitter or on Instagram.
Awesome. Thank you, Colin. Bye, everybody.